Mixing with Mike mixing tip. In this, we're going to talk a little bit about dynamic equalization using drums as an example here. And so what I want to do here is because I've had some questions recently about dynamic EQs, and you see some people have created dynamic EQs, and what I want to I want to kind of get people to understand a little bit of this concept of what a dynamic EQ is. Dynamics basically respond to the material that's fed into it. So whatever the source material is, dynamics will respond dynamically, for lack of a better term, to what is being fed into it. And that includes frequency response patterns, transient patterns, sustain or RMS patterns, et cetera, et cetera. And that's unique to every sound. So basically the ADSR cycle has a large play in how it will respond. Okay, so when we work with dynamics, of course, you set attack and release times and all that sort of stuff. And most compressors they're all full frequency, right? They operate on the full frequency band. Now, if you start dividing up and creating crossovers and you create a multi-band compressor, then what you have essentially is a dynamic EQ. So whether the interface looks like an EQ or looks like a compressor, the functionality is basically the same. Okay, and I'm going to show you the most raw, simple example, right? So, for example, a de-esser is actually a dynamic EQ because when you actually apply a de-esser, what it's doing is it's focused in on particular frequency where those S's occur, right? In that, 4, 5, 6K range. And when something shoots through there, it triggers compression or gain reduction, right? So you're getting an attenuation. And if you set it so that it only acts on high frequencies, then it will only dip high frequencies. That's a dynamic EQ. So not a full band thing, but just a dynamic thing. So what I want to really show here is how we can take something like a snare drum and add presence to it. And I'm starting with a raw preset here. So I'm not starting with anything that is like where I already have it set up or anything like that. So just starting raw with it. And what I have is a C1 compressor with sidechain. And what's cool about this is that if I work in a mode called split mode, then what I can effectively do is I can create a section here where the compression or expansion, in this case, the way I'm going to use it, will work, right? So if I take, like, for example, this snare, and I monitor this, I can actually focus on the frequency area that I kind of want to work in. And then, so if I'm looking to add like some snap into the EQ, then what I'm doing is I'm going to focus this particular area in around the frequency, the snap of the snare drum. And I'm going to go back to my audio channel here. And in EQ split mode, the dynamics processing only gets applied to the red area, the red frequency area, and not to anything else. So this is a cool way because sometimes when you use and this snare isn't too bad, but sometimes you get a lot of bleed of hi-hat and cymbals into the kick or the snare. And what ends up happening is that if you try to boost with EQ, what ends up happening is you're just adding this harshness to the cymbals that makes it really kind of impossible. And then the next thing is to gate, but then gating usually sounds weird and you're dealing with triggering and all that sort of thing. So with this, because it's so focused within a particular area here, what I can do is I can apply something that's a little bit unique and a little bit different here, which is actually expansion. So instead of a ratio that goes like 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 4 to 1, my ratio is going to go 0.5 to 1, 0.6 to 1, 0.7 to 1. Okay, so it's below. So what's happening is it's expanding. It's becoming an upward expander here. And now I'm going to set my threshold accordingly. So what I'm doing is that's boosting. And it's kicking in, so that's the kick drum that's bleeding in down at the bottom. All right, so you could hear that high frequency area added in. And so what I'm effectively doing is I'm just compressing upward just the frequency area, and then I can set the release time. Like, how long do I want it to hold out? So I can make it very focused. Or I can make it longer. So this is going to be very different than like a normal EQ. So if we can listen to this. So you hear that extra snap? So I'm not doing it in an incredibly dramatic way, but what's happening is if I tried to add in, 4 or 5 dB at 2K to get that snap, it would also create a lot more bleed with all the other instruments, right? So this is like one way that I can kind of bring that snappiness out. That's actually kind of cool. And then it pulls right back almost like a gate, and it kind of closes down. Now, if I wanted to, what I could actually do is, if I wanted to kind of tone down and give it a little bit more of a gating kind of action, what I would do is I would bring the overall makeup gain down a little bit. Sorry, I was just looking for the feature. So if I bring this down a little bit, then what it'll do is it'll basically attenuate this frequency range, okay, when it's not, which is the reason why I'm not doing it at the output, because I can do it here and it's only working within this frequency band. So it's actually cutting those frequencies except for when the snare hits. And now it's less high end because overall that area, right, it's boosting up. But I can create a little bit of an attenuation in there, if that makes sense, right? So it kind of becomes like a filtered kind of gate. So, and that's a way that you could do this like with a kick drum or a snare drum where there's a lot of cymbal bleed, and just have that pulled back when the cymbals are playing, and then only when the snare hits does it sort of snap out. And then you're not getting the choked feeling that you get with a gate, which is kind of cool. So to work a kick drum, I can get a little bit more extravagant here with a multiband. This is a C6, which is sort of the multiband 6-band version of this. So I have 2 floating bands down here. And what I'm going to do with these guys is I'm going to focus them in on like a similar area. Like I want to bring out the attack of the kick and the low end of the kick. So I'm going to just kind of, I'm going to find that. All right, so I'm finding that fundamental there, and then I'm going to kind of adjust. I'm going to narrow the Q a little bit here, and then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to set the range upward, right? So I'm going to push this upward. So I think I kind of flattened that out a little bit too much, right? So this is going to boost it, okay, but it's going to boost it dynamically, and I'm going to do a similar type of thing up here. And I'm going to focus this on a little bit more on the kick drum frequency so I can bring out the attack a little bit more. And I'm going to bring... And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the attack times here. I'm going to pull the attack times down, and I'm going to pull the release times back a little bit here. So on this, I want to kind of to be fast. And maybe set this so only the kick triggers it. And when I do the same thing with the low end. And then, so to sort of balance this off now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of work in this in-between area as a way to kind of get this to dynamically dip at that same range or in that same area. So I'm going to kind of move this around, and I'm going to take this sort of low band here, and I'm going to have the range pulled downward. So what it's doing is it's dipping in that particular area. Oops, I'm pulling the wrong one. And I'm going to have this work sort of in conjunction with this guy. Like I may actually make this a little bit, you know, sometimes I can kind of do this with a bit more focus on the tempo and finding frequencies or release settings that work there. So this is without it. And if I wanted to get rid of some of that high-end stuff there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this down, and then I'm going to bring the gain down here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this band over. I'm going to bring the gain down, and then the range way up here. So I'm going to get this to kind of pop up when the kick hits. So what it's doing is it's pushing up and then pulling back, right? Trying to get it to trigger mostly on the kick and not the snare, but that's okay. Without it. And of course I could do this, you know, kind of scaling across here. You know, I'm just going to copy this over to the overheads, and I can get a bit of similar movement, although I might shift the frequency area a little bit, you know, kind of tighten this cue up to be a little bit more focused in a more mid-range area, boxy area, and then focus this a little more broadly. Maybe even take this guy out and kind of work with this guy here so that I can get the overall low end to kind of focus with the oops, I'm trying to pull thing, or I'm trying to pull the ring. And I'm probably not going to do this kind of thing here. Or if anything, what I'm going to do is and I could also work with this guy here if this is too much, you know, to be a little bit more focused or targeted, more like a shelving EQ is what I have here. So let's listen to this with a kick. So, and that's kind of what dynamic EQ is. You're getting the pumping and breathing, but focused within particular frequency areas. And that's kind of the whole idea. And when you start working like this, you think, wow, you kind of want to start to do it with everything. And, you know, and I think for certain things, it works really well, particularly when you have bleeding kind of problems. If the sound is tonally balanced overall, an EQ is going to give you much more flexibility, and it's certainly much easier to set up. But in problem situations, this is a much more focused and intensive way to really balance out a sound and get focus, particularly in that kick drum, where it's a very hollow, open kick drum, no packing. And so all of that resonance is sort of a little bit too beach ball-like. And this kind of hones it in a little bit and focuses it right in the particular areas. And when we keep a similar approach from, you know, the kick, the snare, and the overheads in particular in this drum setup, we could do the similar type of thing with the toms, then we can really get like a nice kind of open character and an open sound. All right, there you have it. There's a Mixing with Mike mixing tip on dynamic EQ for drums.